Hello, and welcome to this interview in our Research Spotlight series, where we talk to researchers who have used eye tracking technology across a broad range of fields. Today, I have the privilege of speaking with Dr. Gustaf Gredebäck. Dr. Gredebäck is professor in the Department of Psychology at Uppsala University in Uppsala, Sweden. Thank you so much for being here today with us, Dr. Gredebäck.
Oh, hi, nice to be here.
So you have used eye tracking technology for many years. Tell us about how you got started in eye tracking and what was the initial inspiration.
I started very many years ago with eye tracking, so it was 24 years ago. And at that point in time, there were no Tobies or corneal reflection eye tracking was just about to start, actually. So when I started as a PhD student under Claes von Hofsten, who also worked here in Uppsala, it was all about EOG, so putting electrodes on the side of the eyes and just measuring horizontal eye movements, which is a fabulous technique, but really awful if you want to scan anything that's two-dimensional. And at that point in time, just about the year 2000, we got to the lab. The very first was called an ASL eye tracker, which was very, very complicated corneal reflection eye tracker, which we did a lot of nice work with. I mean, for us, it was the true revolution to be able to understand where babies were actually looking, not just if they were habituating or reaching to something. And then over time, we got more and more invested in eye tracking and have used a series of different eye trackers, but to a large extent over the last few years, it's been Tobii.
That's great. So you've seen the technological advancements, and then your research has actually been able to probably change and evolve with the technology as well.
Yeah, to a large degree, I think sort of the type of questions that we're able to answer with corneal reflection eye tracking in infancy are sort of have been the same since the very first technical gadgets. It's just that it was way more complicated to do it at that point. The dropout was a lot larger, and the sampling rate was lower, and the accuracy was lower, of course. But over time, we're able to capture gaze of more infants. And at the same time, I think we've learned a lot about how to develop stimuli and make things interesting to children or infants, so that we can now have very long recordings where we can do a lot of different sort of assessments back to back with a young infant, which is a huge benefit. And of course, for us, with mobile eye tracking, we've been able to go into different parts of the world to do this, which is an exciting new avenue for us.
So tell us a little bit more about the overarching vision of your research. You mentioned you work with infants. Tell us some of the general questions that you're looking to answer about their development.
When it comes to early infancy, we've been very interested in their social capacities and very much focusing on how infants learn about their social world through their own experiences. So in part based on sort of an embodied account of how children actively explore the world and interact with the world, both the physical and the social dimensions of this world, and how those experiences feed into infants' interpretations of the world. So we've often looked at the type of events that the infants experience that fuel their understanding of the world.
I've worked with infants in eye tracking as well, and working with infants can be very challenging. What are some of the measures that you use to understand infant development?
Yeah, it is difficult, but also amazing to be able to work with young infants all day long. But what we've seen over time, particularly when we do longitudinal studies where we have a large group of infants coming back to the lab on multiple occasions, we can see that it's sometimes difficult to see what is a normative behavior or what's considered good at a certain age. And we start to understand that there is both non-linearities in development. We know that in general, but in terms of eye tracking. And also we see a lot of preferences of individuals that may be highly functional and may be good to some extent, but may not follow the preferences of other infants. And this particularly is challenging when we have stimuli where we want to see if children prefer to look at something or something else, or if they can process something or not. And then they might just look at something which has less information, for example, or is less interesting at a certain point in time for a certain child. So for us, we're very much focused on measures that we believe have more clear sort of intuitive meaning to them. And one of those things is predictive eye movements, and which is something we've worked with again for 24 years almost. And our argument is that if an infant is looking at a certain location before something happens there, in preparation for that event happening, and that could be a ball occurring behind an occluder, or it could be the goal of a reaching action, for example, that's clearly functional. Being able to anticipate what's happening in the world is clearly something good. And that makes that a very appealing measure. So if you have an infant fixating on something where there's really nothing happening yet, that's a clear indication of what they believe is going to happen next. Another measure that we've been heavily invested in is pupil dilation. And this is something we started, we published the first papers in 2010, I think, around that time, trying to really understand the surprise reaction that comes from a baby when they see things that they didn't expect. And with pupil dilation, we can measure that on a trial-by-trial basis, which is, a much more higher accuracy than what you would get in an habituation study, for example, where you get sort of a singular measure of whether a child is sort of surprised at the sequence of events. Here we can look in real time how their surprise reactions evolve, and that's something I think is amazing and super exciting.
That's amazing. So you can find that infants do have these predictive gaze patterns, and you can measure these surprise reactions. So what would you highlight as the main finding of your work so far, or what has eye tracking really also allowed you to understand about these early social capacities of infants?
Well, one of the things we did start early on was actually to demonstrate that infants have these anticipatory capacities. So, for example, if an infant observes someone reaching for a goal, the fact that the infants in real time are anticipating the future location of an action, for example, that very basic phenomena is something that we were very early on in documenting. Other things that we've explored quite a lot, and not alone, of course, but out of many labs been interested in things like gaze following. If you have two objects like this and you see a model look like this, the infant will follow and look at that location. And in that particular case, we've been very much invested again in what are the experiences of the child in their life so far that allow them to understand and interpret these events. So it's this integration between the experiences of the child and how they perceive the world and the hypothesis that they formulate about the world that we can capture with their predictive eye movements. That's one central theme of what we do. The other one is going back again to the surprise reactions and pupil dilations, and it's the same idea that we can see that infants from a very young age formulate very clear hypotheses about what's going to happen. And the pupillary response, the surprise reaction, is sort of the second stage of that. So they usually make an estimation or an anticipation about what's going to happen. And when that is incorrect, we see these surprise reactions that feed into a learning loop where they sort of start to update their internal models and gain more knowledge through their own errors, which is sort of a very, very early form of exploration and error-based learning.
That's really awesome. And you mentioned that you do some longitudinal studies. Do you find that these types of capacities will change and develop over time with individual infants or in groups?
They do change over time. So, I mean, a particular event can be very meaningful for a 6-month-old baby, for example. And when things doesn't happen as they expect, they get very surprised. But if you take the same baby back at 12 months, they may not be surprised at all anymore because it's not sort of at the center of their hypothesis creating sort of ideas anymore. But we can still make very sort of interesting long-term associations. So these pupillary dilations, surprise reactions we see in 6-month-old babies, they're associated with quite a lot of interesting things at about 2 years of age, for example. And then they're connected to some aspects of executive functions or also sort of pro-social type behaviors that we see links between the eye movements of a 6-month-old and the tendency for a 2-year-old to sort of support others in a sort of constructive manner when their help is needed. So there are clearly these interesting long-term associations, which we've just started to understand.
Wow, that's really great. Now, you mentioned that you've been traveling the world with eye trackers to access different types of populations outside of Sweden. You've been to Bhutan and some other cities in Africa. Tell us about how these projects came to be.
Yeah, we as many researchers are sort of aware of the fact that we're sampling a very skewed part of the world's population.
Mhm.
And in Uppsala in particular is an academic city, a small academic city in the world. And the parents that come to us, we're extremely grateful for them joining our research projects. But it's a very skewed sample even of people living in Uppsala. It's people usually with an academic background and that have studied at the university or worked at the university. And when trying to reach out to a broader community in Uppsala turned out to be really difficult, and it's something we still struggle with. So in the process of that, about 6 years ago, we started to think about if we could look into other parts of the world. And the starting point, we had two different starting points actually. One was to look at the map and discuss in the lab where are things as different as possible to Sweden. Not war or starvation, but just culturally, geographically, religiously, most different. And we landed on Bhutan, which is a place which we had some knowledge of, but clearly know more about now, which we figured would be as different as you could possibly get within sort of as a country. And it's a small country in the Himalayas between India and China. So we spent several years trying to build capacity and trust and interest in what we do in Bhutan. And we now have a very strong and long-going collaboration and many studies taking place here and there. Actually, Wednesday next week, we have a team of 4 researchers from Bhutan coming here to train on a particular task that we're going to assess there.
Awesome.
So and that led us into other countries, like we've been in Harare in Zimbabwe, where we have very good colleagues, and we've done work in Uganda in refugee camps, trying to understand how maternal mental health and experiences of war and global warming that are really tough experiences for parents and particularly mothers impact their infants. So that's something we're working on at the moment to understand. And the other parallel process that started at the same time as Bhutan is this focus on children in adversity of different kinds, and we particularly looked at children who lived in Aleppo during the siege, and again trying to understand through long interviews with the mothers and their fathers how they feel and the experiences that the parents have had, and how that has impacted child development.
So you interview the parents, but then you also do some eye tracking assessments with the infants, right?
Yeah, it varies. So we often in these studies, and the theme varies. So it's sometimes it's about poverty, or it's about being part of a minority group in a certain cultural context. But it also things like how are infants and children impacted by urbanization, or just general mental health problems that we see in a large part of parents for various reasons across the globe. So in order to understand that, we have quite long interviews with parents, and they're based on sort of questionnaires, but we usually, in order to be able to compare across cultures, we have experimenters that interview and ask questions in the culturally appropriate way and in the language that the person we're speaking with understands. And then the experimenter fills in questionnaires based on these answers. And on the side, we do tests of children's social, emotional, and cognitive capacities and other things. And when we do studies with older children, we don't use eye tracking. So then we use more standardized tests because I think that they sort of do the job for us quite well. And we have sort of norm data, maybe not from these populations, but we can sort of relate it to other test sets in the world that's quite sort of well established. But when it comes to infants, that's so much harder. And then we really need eye tracking, and we highly value the use of eye tracking as a non-verbal way to assess child development in a way that can be sort of compared across the globe.
So what does some of the data that you've collected in these other cultures suggest so far about the difference between child development in Sweden and some of these other countries?
It depends a lot on the age of the child, I should say. So first of all, a general theme that we're capturing is that the mental health of mothers is an essential component for child development. And this is true for 16-year-olds that have lived in Aleppo, or for babies in Bhutan, for example, or for example for babies in Sweden as well. So there's nothing unique really here. But other than that, sort of the performance level of an average infant in all of the countries we've been is very similar. So there seems to be some very strong similarities in the capacities of very young infants that are more similar than what we thought. So there seems to be universality in some of the capacities that we see, and also similar vulnerabilities. But what we see as different are the protective factors. They seem to be very some of them are sort of universal, but some of them are very specific to a certain culture or geographical location.
And what are some of the protective factors that you found in the different cultures?
Yeah, one thing that we often see is the social support that parents have in relationship to mental health issues. So if there's a lot of people backing up the parents and being there for the parents, that is something that is very good for. It supports parents' mental health, but it also minimizes the transfer to children in those cases where the parents have larger challenges. But in certain cultures, religion is very important. And that is not for everyone. So that in a cultural context where religious practices are very often occurring in sort of a strong and important dimension of social life, that then being religious, but in particularly engaging in religious practices, is something that's a very important factor. In other cases, it's a lot with values, autonomous relatedness values, or how you view yourself with respect to other people around you, for example.
That's so interesting. So what are some of the most exciting applications that you see in eye tracking for the future, or ways that you can use eye tracking or that other people could?
There's so many interesting things, I think, but one is the mobility of eye trackers, and that has increased quite a lot, and I think will continue to increase the robustness of being able to just use a very small eye tracker together with a laptop in any setting, really, and that we can replicate the very same study in the nurse's office in Bhutan or in a residential area in Harare. Those things are just amazing. You can put it in a bag and just head out into the field. And then another part that is, that I think everyone is really sort of eager for is the web-based solutions, which there are so many initiatives for, but we'll see how far that will take us actually. But it's an interesting avenue for sure. So those would be sort of the technical dimensions that I'm really looking forward to in the future.
I think those also help to overcome the weird bias and the challenges that you mentioned earlier, being able to access people who might not be able to come to a lab. Maybe they're in a place where there aren't researchers, but you can test them and understand people in their homes as they interact with computers or other types of social stimuli.
Yeah. And actually, when you say that, one thing more that we've discussed a lot in the lab is, so all the studies we do together with people in other cultural contexts, of course, we have local collaborators who are researchers locally and may not know, or usually never have been confronted with an eye tracker, but have other expertise. And then we usually provide an eye tracker that we sort of donate or leave there as part of the collaboration. And what is really hard for a lot of people is to sort of start to use that independently, because there's so much you need programming, and you need sort of experience using these technical gadgets. So sort of I could imagine a situation further down the line in the near future where the whole analysis pipelines are also more easily accessible to people. That I think is something that will really sort of increase the use of these types of technologies outside the sort of Western global north type of places where the techniques have been used so far. to really go to the fact that people across the globe use these technologies independently of those of us who've used them for many years.
Right. So what advice would you share with other researchers who are potentially interested in adopting eye tracking for their own work?
I think it is fairly, I mean, to some extent, it is fairly simple. So just get started and try things out. I think that's the most important thing. And it's of course, if people have a lot of programming experience and experience with these types of techniques or other similar techniques, you can do amazingly complicated things, right? But just a very simple eye tracking study of how to an infant or whatever group you're interested in look at social scenes or natural environments. There's so much to learn without it having to be so fancy. I think it's pretty much a plug and play. So give it a go.
Give it a go. I love that. Is there anything else that you'd like to add or mention as we're wrapping up our conversation?
No, I think I'm good. Thank you for the conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Me too. I hope everyone who watches enjoys this. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and knowledge, and wish you the best of luck on your travels. And we can't wait to read your next papers as they come out.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.